Bankers often hold important roles in finance ministries around the world. This pattern begs the question, why the obsession with bankers? Can the new finance minister, with a background in banking, usher in the necessary reforms for Pakistan? Bankers often hold important roles in finance ministries around the world. Take, for instance, Mnuchin in the United States, Rishi Sunak from the United Kingdom, Egypt's Hafez Ghanem, and South Africa's Tito. These are just a few examples of bankers leading the charge in steering economy. That makes us wonder, do bankers inherently possess the competence required to lead economies?
To put it very simply, the finance minister is responsible for the fiscal policy. Now, the fiscal policy is the government's use of spending and taxation to achieve certain economic outcomes. And those economic outcomes can be growth, price stability, reducing unemployment, reducing income inequality or poverty alleviation, and so on. So economic policies can be expansionary, where the government either increases their spending or reduces taxes to stimulate consumption and investment. Or the economic goals can be contractionary, where the opposite is done to control inflation. Now, in terms of activities, the finance minister is responsible for the annual budget, which basically projects the sources and uses of funds, and where there's a deficit, then they have to present a plan for plugging this gap as well. And this gap can be plugged through borrowings, which can be domestic as well as external, and also through privatization of public sector enterprises, which brings in money as well. Now, coming to your question, what skills do they need? One, they need to have a sound understanding of economics and finance. So senior bankers tend to have an acute sense of how various policy interventions affect various segments of the economy, various industries, and what works, what kind of interventions work, what kind of interventions are less effective. So yes, to put it very simply, they do have the skills. But what is more important than just having competence or skills is having the backing of the Prime Minister, so that they're able to implement politically unpopular decisions.
Not to be overlooked, Pakistan has a track record of appointing bankers to steer its economy. Figures like Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, Shaukat Aziz, Shaukat Talim, Dr. Hafez Sheikh, and most recently Muhammad Aurangzeb Khan come to mind. This pattern begs the question, why the obsession with bankers?
The Pakistani context, politically unpopular decisions essentially mean that you want to broaden the tax net and tax previously untaxed segments of the economy, or you want to pull away certain subsidies, which also tends to be very contentious. So all kinds of revenue generating measures that step on certain toes. So somebody needs to support you all the way through, even when they feel that there is a political fallout. So the finance minister, logically, they can present a policy and all the list of actions that ought to be taken. But then if they don't have political support, then they are not able to implement or execute that effectively. They also need strong allies across other ministries as well, for example, planning or commerce, so that the execution and implementation doesn't happen in a hostile environment and they don't face roadblocks. The idea is that whatever interventions they have planned or designed, they are able to be implemented and executed with as less friction as possible. So yes, competence is certainly required.
Pakistan grapples with a host of economic hurdles, including a sizable population living in poverty and a high inflation rate. Last June, the country teetered on the brink of default, facing diminishing foreign reserves and a weakening currency. Moreover, Pakistan confronts an imminent debt repayment challenge with significant external debt due by June 2024. It's often emphasized that the country needs fundamental reforms to foster economic growth. Can the new finance minister, with a background in banking, usher in the necessary reforms for Pakistan?
The number one priority right now is managing our unsustainable debt burden. And when I say unsustainable debt burden, I'm referring to both domestic as well as foreign borrowing. One, there's accumulated debt balance that needs servicing. And two, with every budget that comes with a deficit, there is more amount that gets added to that debt balance. So we need a two-pronged approach. One, in the short term, we need to come up with ways to deal with this accumulated debt balance, and going forward, long term, we need to have structural reforms so that the stock of deficit or the debt that we're accumulating every year from a budgetary deficit is not added on and used towards unproductive non-revenue generating activities. So short term, yes, we need to onboard the IMF again. We need to have discussions with our bilateral lenders. But like I said, eventually we need a permanent solution to this funding gap, and structural reform is the way to go. So we need to encourage investments in export-oriented sectors. On the revenue side, we need to broaden the tax base, phase out non-productive subsidies or tax benefits to certain sectors, and then, if you are providing them tax holidays or temporary relief, then that has to be linked with performance-related benchmarks. And again, we have a huge population, so we need spending on infrastructure, on education, on upskilling people, on healthcare, and other utilities that many people cannot access, so that we have capacity development within the country as well. To deliver economic outcomes, you need a skilled labor force. So a huge population that is unskilled and underfed is not an asset, it's a liability. So it is the government's job eventually to address these gaps, these skill gaps, these resource gaps through policies and as well as public sector spending. But public sector spending requires you to have room in the budget to be able to spend on these key activities. So we are in a very difficult position right now, and yes, certainly this is a very tough job.